Remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the 1st century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the 1st century after Jesus.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. Let's talk a little bit about Bayes' theorem. I want to talk about Bayes' theorem and the swamping of the priors. I can see this is going to mess up my PowerPoint the way it is formatted, but I think we can still live with that. So this is known as the odds form of Bayes' theorem. If you have two hypotheses, can I move around with the sound okay? So if we have two hypotheses, H and not H, the probability of each of them on evidence E will be equal to the probability of H and not H in and of themselves. That's this term here. And the degree to which each of H and not H makes the evidence E likely. This is called the explanatory likelihood or explanatory power. This is called the prior probabilities ratio, and that's the posterior probability ratio. So, even if the prior probability ratio is very, very small, if the explanatory power ratio is sufficiently large, then the final probability ratio will itself be very, very large mathematically. You don't need a lot of algebra to see this. If this is a whole lot larger than the degree to which the prior probability is small, then the posterior probability ratio will be very large indeed. And if the prior probability ratio is extremely small, if the explanatory power ratio is massively larger, then the final probability will be extremely large as well. Okay, so this is something I will be using tonight. Let's look at an example from Whately and Napoleon. This is Richard Whately, who wrote a very important book, very famous book called Historic Doubts Relative to Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'll let Napoleon speak for you. So let's let N stand for the hypothesis that Napoleon existed, and this little tilde means not, okay? So not N is the hypothesis that he did not exist. And we can see here by Bayes' theorem that the probability of him existing given the evidence divided by the probability of him not existing given the evidence is equal to the ratio of the prior probabilities times the explanatory power ratios. So let's suppose this is very, very small. Let's suppose it's 10 to the negative 12th. And this is very large, 0.99999999999, so it's very large. So our ratio is approximately 10 to the negative 12th. But let's assume we have 1,000 pieces of evidence, N, excuse me, and so each piece of evidence is made twice as likely by N as not N. So we're going to have a staggering explanatory power ratio. Well, so this will be about 10 to the 300th power, and so you can do the math, right? 10 to the 300th minus, right, 12 will be 10 to the 288 power. We will have a staggering final probability for the existence of Napoleon. In fact, the evidence will make the existence of Napoleon probable to 1 minus 10 to the negative 288th power, which is a massive, massive number, right? We don't normally see things like this. Now, what does this mean for the resurrection? Those who, like Callum, hold that the prior probability of the resurrection divided by the probability of the prior probability of Jesus not rising is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, and who, like the McGrews, hold that the ability of the resurrection to explain the evidence F, right, is at least 10 to the 44th times higher than the probability of the non-resurrection theory to explain the facts F. We will find that the final probability of the resurrection theory will be 1 minus 10 to the 14th, or 0.99999999999. That's a lot of nines. In other words, if the evidence is strong as the McGrews say, and if Callum is right that the prior probability of the resurrection is no less than 10 to the negative 30th, then the final probability of the resurrection will be staggering, given that evidence. Okay, so here's Whatley. I like the swamping of the priors very much. You should, okay? Now, I'm sorry the spacing of this is off. On my home computer it worked fine. Tonight we're going to use the swamping of the priors to show that it is virtually certain that no miracles, not just the resurrection, no miracles at all have ever occurred, including the resurrection. And of course Whatley would say, well, no, I don't like that, okay? And so, time for Callum, okay?
I think, okay, I'll just say a brief bit just to make sure I've explained from my own end, like, everything, but it probably won't be anything new.
I think it may be showing mine now, so
yeah,
to switch.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is mine, okay. So here, is it not? How do you make it stop? Oh, there we go, okay. Okay, so here I've just done R, meaning the resurrection, instead of the normal hypothesis. And yeah, I've got the same form as Greg's put up, but just switched these latter two factors round. So yeah, just basically the main thing, at least from my perspective, to bear in mind is that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is going to be dependent on a few things. And so we don't really need to understand maths hugely to get this. You just need to grasp that it depends on a few different factors which we'll be debating tonight. And the first factor is the prior probability of the resurrection. And that just means how likely is it that the resurrection occurred before we look at any of the evidence. And this is probably going to be quite low. It might not necessarily be really low, and we'll probably debate that, but the idea is that it's fairly low, and then that the evidence will increase the probability so that the final probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is a lot higher. And whether the evidence overcomes that is dependent on this middle factor. And the top part of that middle factor just says the probability of the evidence given the resurrection. That just means if the resurrection happened, would we expect the evidence? Does the resurrection theory roughly predict the evidence we have? And the bottom factor just says, what is the probability of the evidence given that the resurrection didn't happen? And so we might, again, disagree on this, but the idea from someone who's advocating the resurrection is that they will say, if the resurrection didn't happen, this evidence is really, really surprising. We wouldn't expect to find this evidence if the resurrection didn't happen. So the idea is that that bottom factor is low. And if the top factor is high and the bottom factor is low, the whole factor will be a very high number, and so it will increase the original probability for the resurrection. So I think that's pretty much enough to get us covered. And like I say, if you don't understand it completely, don't worry. The idea is that the probability of the resurrection, given the evidence, is dependent on these things, and that's the things we're going to be debating about. Thanks a lot.
Bayes' theorem shows that for an extraordinary claim, your starting probability, the prior, matters. In the case of a resurrection, the prior probability is extremely low because, in all of human history and biology, no confirmed case exists of a person coming back from the dead after days in the grave. Clinically, brain cells begin dying within minutes without oxygen, and irreversible decomposition starts within hours. This is why medical science treats resurrection as biologically impossible. Historically, miracle stories are common in many cultures. Apollonius of Tyana, Romulus, and Osiris all have resurrection legends. Yet we don't accept them as literal history because they lack contemporary, verifiable evidence. The same problem exists with Jesus. The Gospels were written decades after the events by anonymous authors based on oral traditions, and they contradict each other. For example, Matthew 28:8 says the women ran to tell the disciples right away, while Mark 16:8 says they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Using Bayes' theorem honestly, the combination of an extremely low prior probability and weak, inconsistent second-hand evidence means the mathematical odds remain vanishingly small, just as they do for every other resurrection claim in history.
So I'm going to begin with a story. The story is this. The year is around 4 BC. A small, rowdy but unimportant corner of the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is lord over Rome, most of Europe, North Africa, and Israel. It's an unhappy arrangement. Most Jews begrudgingly submit to their de facto king, while others violently resist. In a small countryside of shepherds, fishermen, and outcasts, a baby is born. He grows up fairly modestly, submitting to his parents, working as a manual laborer in nearby towns. 30 years pass, and he might well have lived and died with no one ever knowing. But one day things change. This nobody finds a few other nobodies fishing, and they join him. This nobody performs miracles, not to the important people or to kings, but to peasants. Not to win acclamation, but to heal and to serve. There are no mega churches, no flashing lights, no #1 Yeezy album. He reaches out to oppressed people, to untouchables, and to other outcasts, healing them and inviting them to join his kingdom. To join not for material gain, but for friendship with himself, the king. A king who bends to wash the feet of his subjects and humiliates himself so that the last, the least, and the lost can be honored. And so important people from the city begin to hear things. And so they test him. Who is the king? Do we pay taxes to the king, Caesar? If he says yes, he gets killed by the Jews. And if he says no, he gets killed by the Romans. So Jesus asks, whose image does the coin bear? Caesar, they reply. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The coin bears Caesar's image, but you bear God's image. Caesar can have his coin. I want you who hate me and who try to kill me. And so his disciples later protest at the anger and all the things that have been said against him. And they say, Lord, call down fire on them. Jesus' best friend even goes to kill one of his arresters. But Jesus rebukes him and heals the man. Love your enemies, he tells them. Real enemies, those who arrest you and crucify you. And so as he claims kingship and divine authority, as he judges the important religious people for hating their enemies and outcasts, they kill him. They give him a death so excruciating and lonely that Roman citizens were exempt from it. A death so shameful that Hebrew law regarded the crucified as accursed by God. And so the movement was dead. The wannabe king died as he was born, a lonely, rejected loser from Nazareth. But a few days later, those who followed him and abandoned him began to preach that he was alive and that he was king. Those who rejected him all along began to say the same thing. This band of losers from the Galilean countryside traveled across Europe, Asia, and Africa, declaring that this crucified criminal and blaspheming peasant had been raised from the dead. People from the lakes of Galilee and from the high council in Jerusalem began to throw their lives down for him. They shared any riches they had with the poor, prayed for their enemies, were thrown into prison, and killed with stones and crosses, so that a few decades later, bishops in Syria were writing, "Come, fire and cross, come hacking off of limbs, come crushing of my body, and come the cruel tortures of the devil. Only let me reach Jesus Christ." And the invitation these early Christians had was this: come to join this kingdom with a king who sits not on lofty thrones but nailed to a cross, by his own subject whom he loves and serves. A kingdom that prevails against the corrupt, greedy and violent kingdoms and states of this world. A kingdom that endures against suffering and even against death itself. A kingdom that offers such freedom that those who join in it endure against all afflictions, and such freedom that comes from friendship with the king himself. A freedom from the shackles of shame or guilt, from the need for popularity, from the longing for reputation or acceptance, and from any other secret addiction to money, sex, or whatever else we long for and beat ourselves up over. And so this is a challenge. The king tells me that I must love my enemies and forgive those who wrong me. He tells me that if I don't have time for the lowest, most unimportant person I come across, then I don't have time for the king of the universe himself. And that's the kind of radical acceptance he asks for. But following this servant king is a challenge that many from the very start have accepted, and with it changed the world. So the question now, of course, is, how did this all happen? What led this band of outcasts, council members and Romans to go willingly to their deaths in the name of a public embarrassment? Jesus. I'm going to be arguing that the evidence we have strongly suggests that God raised Jesus from the dead to vindicate his ministry and to start a movement following him. So remarkably, a very strong case can be made even without looking at Christian documents to begin with. Using only non-Christian documents from the first century after Jesus. I'm talking about people here like the Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, Roman writer and governor Pliny the Younger. These are all non-Christian sources writing within the first century after Jesus. And from these people we learn the following: that Christians were widely persecuted across the Mediterranean from a very early age. That Jesus' own brother James was executed by Jewish authorities in AD 62. That Jesus himself was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. That the movement stopped briefly before resuming on the third day, is the language Josephus uses, in Judea before spreading to Rome. That Christians met on a fixed day, as Pliny writes. That Jesus was called the Messiah, the Christ. That he was called and known as a wise man and a miracle worker. And that Christians even prayed to him as a god. That Christians had a stringent moral code, and that they spread widely in large numbers very shortly after Jesus' death. And so it's important not to underestimate the force of this evidence. Many of these facts are attested multiple times across these non-Christian authors and are beyond historical doubt. So, there are a number of other facts we can establish without the resources of Christian writers and biographers. It is virtually certain that any given Jewish criminal in Palestine in the reign of Pilate would be buried in a known place. I have laid out some of this evidence for this elsewhere, and I will just summarize it now. There's a divine command throughout the Old Testament to bury the dead, both for the dead's sake and for the land's sake. Since anyone hung from a tree is cursed according to Deuteronomy, there's an extra reason not to leave someone who was crucified out without being buried. God commands explicitly that anyone executed must be buried properly in order to avoid defiling the land. So this wasn't just something that was for the sake of the dead person. This was something for the land. And so it doesn't matter that Jesus would have been a criminal. What matters is that the land was holy to the Jewish culture. And so there would be an absolute obligation to bury them. This command is reiterated throughout the Old Testament and afterwards, both in apocryphal literature and in the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. In addition, first-century writers Philo and Josephus repeat these same sentiments, and in later rabbinical writings, in Midrash, in the Talmud, and other Jewish writings after the time of Jesus, the need for burial is re-emphasized again and again, and it's even commanded to high priests. This non-Christian historical evidence is clear about burial protocol. Bones from the corpse were collected a year later and put in an ossuary. In the case of criminals, ossuaries would be transferred to the family tomb. Public mourning for criminals was prohibited, so praying inside tombs was often necessary, and excavations have confirmed this. Spices and perfume were typically taken to the tomb, and respected holy men would usually have their tombs venerated. And finally, we know from non-Christian literature, from Jewish writings, that the Sanhedrin, the High Council in Jerusalem, was given a specific duty to provide a tomb for executed criminals. And so, even if there were no reasons to remember where Jesus was buried,
Callum's account is moving, but emotion isn't evidence. When we strip the narrative back to history, the resurrection story starts looking like many other religious legends. Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger, the non-Christian sources often cited, weren't eyewitnesses. Josephus was born after Jesus' death, and the famous resurrection line in Antiquities is recognized by many scholars as a later Christian edit. Tacitus wrote about 80 years later, likely repeating what Christians already claimed. This is exactly what we see with other myths, like Apollonius of Tyana, where later historians recorded stories without verifying supernatural events. The burial claim also doesn't hold under real-world Roman practices. Crucifixion was meant to humiliate, and Rome often denied proper burials to those convicted of treason or sedition. The archaeological record backs this up. Only one crucified victim from Judea, Yehohanan, has ever been found with a burial, and even he appears to have been an exception due to family influence. The Gospels themselves disagree on the burial. Mark 15:46 says, Joseph of Arimathea alone wrapped the body. John 19:39-40 adds Nicodemus and 75 pounds of spices. Matthew 27:62-66 uniquely claims guards were posted. Details that read more like theological embellishment than consistent history. And while Miller frames the spread of Christianity as proof of resurrection, history shows that growth and martyrdom aren't unique to true events. The followers of Sabbatai Zevi in the 1600s, convinced he was the Jewish Messiah, endured persecution even after he converted to Islam. Devotion proves belief, not that the belief is accurate.
Well, I want to reply to Callum. First of all, I've already conceded for the sake of argument that the probability of the resurrection, given the McGrew's evidence F, is very, very high. So, I mean, I said I'd give it a 1 minus 10 to the negative 14th, which is 14 nines. So I already said that. So basically everything Callum had to say is irrelevant. I conceded that to begin with. So, he regave the argument for the resurrection. I already accepted his conclusion and said that is irrelevant to start with. I granted that the resurrection miracles have a high prior probability. I do want to say that Callum did not reply to any of the specifics of the argument I gave, But I want to point out here, I don't know if you can see this. Can everyone see this okay over here? Okay. Callum argues that God would do certain things. It's probable to some degree that he would. I want to argue against Callum that for any proposition P, unless P is actually entailed by, let's use G for theism, since I've used T for testimony. So let's let G be theism. I want to argue that the probability of any proposition P on G is simply undefined unless P is entailed by G, or unless G is logically, probabilistically independent of G. So I want to say that this is simply undefined. G alone does not have enough content. You can't get any specific probabilities out of G alone because G does not have a value theory. You have to add to G some kind of a value theory. So let me write this. This is not a good pen. We'll have to talk about the probability of any proposition P on G conjoined to some value theory G, such as that God has certain obligations to do certain things for humans, right? Now, then you can get some interesting probabilities, but the thing is, your value theory V will need to be proven first, and all the examples Callum has given are where the probability of V is undefined or not high enough. So when he argues that God would be likely to do this or that, I simply think we don't have any proof of that, unless he's speaking of what we call subjective degree of belief. If those are his personal subjective degrees of belief, then I agree with him. Those may indeed be high. But if we're dealing with rational degree of belief, right, epistemic probability, his probabilities are not epistemic, they're personal. I want to go back and talk about something from our debate 3.5 weeks ago that Callum did not address. I meticulously laid out a huge argument showing how if you accept, and much of what Callum had to say about the burial of Jesus and things like that are not in dispute. I simply think those are red herrings. What I argued last time, and I gave a Bayesian argument to show that it was very probable, Callum did not reply to that 3.5 weeks ago, hasn't replied to it tonight. I showed in detail that if you accept the hypothesis that Matthew's purpose in writing his resurrection stories is to supply the missing appearance to the disciples in Galilee that's not in Mark, you can explain every single aspect of the resurrection stories in Matthew. They all fall, the predictions are immediate. They all make perfectly good sense. Matthew includes Jesus' statement to the disciples, "Go to Galilee, there you will see me. I will go before you to Galilee." The angel says that to the women at the tomb, go tell his disciples he's going before you to Galilee. And in fact, in Mark, we have the story where the women are afraid. They say nothing to anyone, but Matthew leaves that out on purpose. This is not because he's a historian. He realizes if he has that story in there, he can't have Jesus appear to the women. And so he cuts that out. He actually has Jesus appear to the women only long enough just to say, get those guys to Galilee. And so they go to Galilee, and there they see Jesus. All this is explained perfectly by Matthew being a literary construction, not actually based on history. This is not to say there was not an empty tomb. It's not to say there were no appearances of Jesus, but it's to say you cannot rely on the gospel details. Now, I showed last time that if you accept this as a literary theory, you can explain the data of Matthew's gospel. If you accept Matthew's gospels being literally historical, you cannot explain this to the same degree. I gave a Bayesian argument. I even assumed once again that the prior probability of the hypothesis that opposes mine is 0.9. I still showed how my hypothesis reaches a high posterior probability. Callum did not address that 3.5 weeks ago. He's not addressed it tonight. I also showed that you can explain Luke's gospel as, again, a literary construction, not based on actual history. I am no ways denying that there were appearances. I explained those last time. The disciples went to Galilee. They saw Jesus the way Jesus told them. He said, Jesus told them before he died, "You will see me risen from the dead." And they went to Galilee because Jesus had told them that's what they'd see. And of course, they meditated, they went into trance states, they did see Jesus risen from the dead. Not as a physical body, but as some kind of a ghostly-like apparition. Callum made a big point over the fact that they knew the difference between ghosts and bodies. This is true. But Jesus told them that they would see him up in heaven as a spiritual figure. They saw exactly what he told them they'd see. Now, when we move on to the Gospel of Luke, which is 30 years later, I again claim 3.5 weeks ago tonight that you can explain all the details of Luke's Gospel as a literary construction. He leaves out Jesus' statement, go to Galilee. Why does he do that? Because Luke has all the appearances either in Jerusalem or right near Jerusalem. He can't have the disciples go to Galilee. If they run off to Galilee, they won't be able to see him in Jerusalem that very day, right? So he cuts that story out. It's not a coincidence that Matthew has that and Luke cuts it out. You can explain this as a purely literary construction. The appearance to the women by the two angels in the tomb, and what you can't see this here, unfortunately, it's not clear enough, but if you compare the statement of the angels in Luke to what is said in Mark, Luke is a very conservative author. He'll only change an earlier author if he has to, and he makes little changes what Jesus has to, what the angel says. He leaves in Jesus told you, and he leaves in the word Galilee, but now he says, do you remember how Jesus told you while he was still in Galilee, right? And go home and don't take my word for it. Never take my word for it. Go home, compare the statement of the angels in Luke to the statement of the angels in Matthew to Mark. And you can easily see changes being made by the later authors on purpose. The appearance to Peter, the appearance at Emmaus, the appearance in the upper room, right? All those are literary constructions because Luke has a need to have Jerusalem as the central place, the birthplace of Christianity. If you take that hypothesis, it explains all the literary data you find in Luke. It explains also why in John, right, you find Jesus appearing in the upper room too, because John is a later gospel. It explains the Thomas story. It explains why Jesus later on appears in Galilee, because John knows both Matthew, who only has an appearance in Galilee, and John knows of Luke, who has appearances only in Jerusalem, so John has them both. He's the latest gospel. You can explain all of this. So Callum made a big deal about the details of the appearances, that they were multimodal, talking with Jesus, walking with him, touching him. All that comes from simply not responding to my literary hypothesis, which I gave a Bayesian argument for 3.5 weeks ago today, to show, and we can call that up to show that this, you cannot rely on the Gospels in detail as evidence for the resurrection. You can get some general points from them, but you can't press the details. At least this much. Neither the McGrews, Craig, Lacona, nor here Callum have responded to my detailed Bayesian argument otherwise. So I would still wait for Callum to reply to that. Callum said briefly that he could account for the laws of nature on the resurrection hypothesis, but again, Callum did not do what I did. I gave 3 mutually exclusive, jointly exhaustive hypotheses. Again, I accepted his conclusion that the posterior probability of the resurrection on the facts of F is 1 minus 10 to the 14th. I accepted that. And again, he did not respond to the fact that my argument takes this into account and shows that the ultimate probability of the resurrection on all the evidence being E, turns out to be remarkably low.
Greg Cavin's closing point cuts to the heart of the problem for the Christian claim. You can't just assume what God would want to do without proving it first. God raised Jesus is not an inevitable conclusion from theism. It's an assumption built on a specific theological value system that itself needs evidence. Without that, you're not working with objective probability, just personal belief. The gospel accounts themselves are another major issue. When you line up Matthew, Luke, and John, you see deliberate literary editing to serve theological goals, not consistent historical reporting. Matthew pushes Galilee appearances, Luke erases them to keep events in Jerusalem, and John tries to harmonize both traditions because he's writing even later. This is exactly how legendary development works. Later writers reshape earlier stories to fit new purposes. We also know from ancient biography studies that the Gospels follow the patterns of Greco-Roman literary construction, not modern investigative history. Scholars like Bart Ehrman and Michael Goulder have shown how changing small details, like who first saw Jesus, where he appeared, or what was said, was common in ancient storytelling to make a theological point. That's why the contradictions in the resurrection narratives are not trivial. They are signs we're looking at crafted literature, not reliable eyewitness reports. Even if you grant, for the sake of argument, a high probability for appearances, that doesn't prove a physical resurrection. Visions and apparitions are well-documented psychological phenomena, especially in grief. From Marian apparitions to loved ones seen after death. The disciples' experiences fit that pattern far better than a violation of all known biological laws. So, when all the evidence is considered, historical context, textual editing, human psychology, the probability of a literal resurrection remains remarkably low. Passionate belief can spread a story, but belief is not the same as truth. If the resurrection stories were shaped by theological agendas and later editing, can we really treat them as reliable historical evidence? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you found this breakdown useful, and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the history and evidence behind religious claims.
Why is it wrong, peculiarly, for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Like a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity. Right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's
of social behavior, which they call acting morally.
We might wonder, what makes it wrong? And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Is it just a matter of opinion? Now that's tricky. Of course, we're going to be arguing about whether or not God's necessary for morality, what shape morality has, and so forth and so on. And all of that, in some sense, is just a matter of opinion. But I take it the deeper question is there a fact of the matter as to who's right? Not just as there's a fact of the matter as to whether or not there is a God and what that God is like. I take it there's a fact of the matter with regard to whether or not it's wrong to harm people, whether it's wrong to rape, for example. I think it's wrong to rape. I take this to not just be a matter of opinion. It's not as though if I thought otherwise rape would be okay, or if everybody thought otherwise rape would be okay. Rape is wrong, full stop. So at least if you're worried about whether there could be genuine morality, where there are facts of the matter, then on an atheist account, I'm inclined to think, well, of course there can. We might wonder, what makes it wrong? And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Might ask instead, what do we mean in saying that it's wrong to rape? Now, this is a controversial matter, and not all moral philosophers agree about the ingredients that we need to build into the basic definition of right and wrong. But roughly, I take it that as at least a first pass, the thought is something like to believe in morality as a genuine, objective state of affairs is to believe that there are reasons to act morally, to help others and to avoid harming them, and that these reasons don't depend on the particular desires or goals you happen happen to have. It's not as though if you happen to care about truth, justice, and the American way, then you've got a reason to act morally. No, everybody has these reasons. These reasons are overriding, to use philosophers' jargon, they're categorical reasons. So when I say that it's an objective fact that rape is wrong, what I'm saying is there's this kind of overriding, strong, categorical reason not to harm people in this way. And that's not up to me to make it so, it's just so. Now, we might ask, is there a deeper account that can be offered about where these reasons come from, or what makes them so, or the basic rules of morality, what their ultimate foundation or basis is? And I want to say that secular atheist philosophers disagree about that point. Some are, as we might call them, non-foundationalists. They say, well, we can state the various moral rules, keep your promises, tell the truth, don't tell lies, don't hurt people, help the needy. And if we want, we can boil these rules down into a simpler set of rules. I've suggested don't harm, do help. But there may be nothing at all deeper to be said about what makes those rules what makes those rules the valid rules. It's just an objective fact about reality that there are these categorical reasons. There are reasons to behave in certain ways versus other. So that's not just a matter of opinion. There are facts about what there are reasons to do. And these may be among the reasons that there's nothing deeper to say. But there are also philosophers who believe there is something more to say. And again, unsurprisingly, different philosophers will disagree about what that deeper story looks like. Let me give a very quick sketch of one such story. I think it's not bad as far as it goes. Ultimately, I think there's even more to say, but that would take us a rather long time to say that more. So let me just give you the quick sketch. It's a version of the view that's known as contractarianism. The thought is that the moral rules are the rules that we would give to one another to govern our interactions with one another, the rules that we would agree to if we were to set about trying to settle on a bunch of rules to govern our interactions under the assumption that we were perfectly rational. Nobody wants to follow rules that people accept because of mistakes in their reasoning. So imagine us, but soup ourselves up to be reasoning perfectly rational beings would agree to various rules to govern their interactions. And the rules that they agree to are the terms of morality. Now, there's different ways of running this contractarian thought. One version of it, which I have some sympathies to, adds an extra twist. The reasoning needs to take place behind a so-called veil of ignorance. The thought is, I'm not going to know while I'm engaged in this hypothetical bargaining session what my actual position in society is. I won't be able to try to rig things in favor of white males because I won't know that I'm a white male. So I argue from behind this veil of ignorance about my actual identity. So that's the basic thought. So here we have a kind of deeper story. Where do the moral rules come from? They are the rules we would give to ourselves to govern our behavior with one another insofar as we were perfectly rational. Does this capture a notion of objectivity for ethics? It seems to me the answer is yes. There's a fact of the matter about what it would be rational for us to agree to in terms of these rules. One might wonder, is the output of this hypothetical, imaginary bargaining session, are the moral rules necessary? Maybe that's another feature we're looking for in trying to genuinely get morality as opposed to merely the illusion or appearance of morality. And the answer to that is yes, I believe they are necessary. Now, if you're a non-foundationalist, if you don't think there is a deeper story of the contractarian sort that I sketched, or some other deeper story that other moral philosophers have sketched, if you're a non-foundationalist, you might just stop it right here. You might say, to say that murder is wrong is to say that there's a categorical reason not to murder, and this isn't a contingent truth, it's a necessary truth. It's a truth that obtains, as philosophers like to put it, in all possible worlds, that murder would be wrong. If we do go the contractarian route, then we instead might put our necessity a little bit deeper. We might say something like, the moral truths are necessary, but their truth is itself explained in terms of the social contract, and that in turn is explained in terms of the fact that there are certain truths about reasoning. And these are necessary truths. It's a necessary fact that perfectly rational beings would reason about what kinds of rules they wanted to give to one another in such and such a way. So I think we can get the necessity of morality as well. Here's a rather different objection that might get raised. We have the thought that morality involves commandments. We have the thought that morality involves requirements. We talk about moral laws. So sometimes it's suggested that where there's a commandment, there's got to be a commander. Where there's a law, there's got to be a lawgiver. Where there's a requirement, there's got to be a requirer. Who plays the role of commander, lawgiver, requirer? Well, it's got to be God. And so it turns out if we're really going to have the notion not just of moral reason to behave in this way or that way, but rather moral requirements to behave in one way rather than another way, then we need to appeal to God after all, to be the lawgiver. This is an argument that's been proposed by various theistic philosophers. Indeed, this very argument's been embraced by some atheistic philosophers who said, yeah, talk of moral requirements does presuppose a lawgiver. Now that I no longer believe in God, I believe there are no moral requirements. Now, I'm not myself inclined to go that way. I'm perfectly prepared to talk about moral requirements. I think it's a completely appropriate thing to do. In fact, it would be inappropriate, it would be just simply mistaken, full stop, to give up talk about moral requirements. So the question I want to push a little bit is it really true that requirements require a requirer? That's a mouthful.
Kagan's argument is grounded in some of the most well-respected traditions in philosophy and science. First, the claim that laws require a lawgiver is a category mistake. We talk about laws in physics, like gravity or thermodynamics, but no one thinks there's a divine being issuing those. Moral laws can function the same way. They describe how rational beings ought to treat each other, especially when suffering, fairness, or autonomy is involved. Second, Kagan's appeal to contractarianism isn't abstract theory. It reflects real-world values we use to build just societies. Think of the U.S. Constitution. It wasn't handed down from heaven. It was written by people trying to reason through fairness from multiple perspectives. That's the same spirit behind Rawls' veil of ignorance, which has influenced everything from ethics in healthcare to international human rights. And science backs this up. Frans de Waal's work with primates shows empathy, fairness, and conflict resolution emerging without religion. In human children, studies from Yale's Baby Lab show moral decision-making before they can speak, proving morality isn't downloaded from above. It's wired into social creatures like us.
The question before us this evening is God necessary for morality? Notice what the question is not asking. We are not asking whether belief in God is necessary for morality. No one in tonight's discussion is arguing that in order to live a moral life, you need to believe in God. Rather, the question, as Shelley emphasized, is whether God is necessary for morality. And the answer to that question, I think, obviously depends on what you mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously this sort of behavior could still go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior, which they call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many atheists and theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human convention or illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue that God is necessary for morality in at least three distinct ways. Without God, objective moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability would not exist. Let's look at the first point. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, when we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. To say, for example, that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them so that everyone believed the Holocaust was good. My first claim is that if there is no God, then moral values are not objective in that sense. Traditionally, objective moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. He is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. End quote. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, There can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation of speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
Craig argues that if there's no God, then moral values can't be objective. But that's simply false, and most contemporary philosophers know it. According to a massive 2020 Phil Papers survey of professional philosophers, over 70% believe in moral realism, that objective moral truths exist, while only a minority tie those truths to religion. Craig says evolution makes morality an illusion. But evolution explains how we became aware of morality, not that morality isn't real. Think about pain. It evolved to help us survive, but that doesn't make suffering an illusion. Same with morality. It's an evolved feature that lets us cooperate, prevent harm, and protect the vulnerable. And as for humans being just apes on a rock, that's emotional bait. The truth is, we're rational beings capable of empathy, reflection, and responsibility. Morality arises from our ability to weigh consequences, respect others, and seek fairness. That doesn't require a divine being. It requires thinking beings who care how their actions affect others.
Why is it wrong, peculiarly, for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Make him a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I were to engage in that behavior, we can reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay, I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best that answer would go to show that rationality, or the ability to reflect rationally on things, is a necessary condition for moral behavior, but I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it, a reason that I'm capable of recognizing. And if you ask, well, what more does it take? The answer is, well, those are the basic ingredients right there. We can refine it. I mean, we can put a little icing on it if we'd like to make it. But in terms of the essentials, that's it. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
Well, obviously the kind of answer that I offered, but
can I ask just to follow up on that? Because I'm tempted to say I could play this game, and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game, but I could pose the same kinds of questions to you. Perhaps I will, in 10 minutes. I could say, look, all right, so God says, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
So, how does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special. Insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
Shelley Kagan's response cuts to the core of what makes morality work: self-awareness, empathy, and rationality. You don't need a divine spark. You need a mind capable of reflection and understanding. That's not a guess. It's supported by data. Cognitive scientists like Michael Tomasello have shown that once humans develop the ability to take another's perspective and understand shared intentions, Moral reasoning emerged naturally. We're moral because we evolved the capacity to care, reflect, and cooperate, not because a divine being handed down commands. Craig wants morality to be about divine authority, but his view collapses under scrutiny. If God says something is wrong, is it wrong because he says so, or is it wrong for deeper reasons? That's the Euthyphro dilemma, and Craig never escapes it. If morality comes from God's commands, then genocide, slavery, or torture could be good if God wills it. And history shows this is more than a hypothetical. The Bible condones slavery, patriarchal violence, and genocide. That's not a moral foundation, it's moral hazard. And when Craig downplays evolution, he's ignoring reality. Moral emotions like guilt, empathy, and fairness aren't random. They're observable in humans and even in animals. Studies on capuchin monkeys, for example, show they reject unequal pay. That's a primitive sense of justice. No religion required. In short, Kagan's view fits what we actually see in the world. We don't need a lawgiver to understand fairness. We need minds capable of seeing others as people, not tools. That's what morality is built on. And it doesn't need God to exist. So the real question is, if our brains are wired for compassion and fairness, isn't that a better foundation than ancient rules written by people who thought slavery was moral? Let us know what you think. Drop a comment, like the video if this made sense, and subscribe for more clear, fact-based breakdowns of big questions.